Hytale's mob spawning animations have recently been a topic of conversation on Twitter, with Mr. John Hytale saying that the best spawn animation goes to Camp Chork. I have a special theory for what he means by spawning animation, so stick around to learn more. It is not clear when spawning animations will be used. We've never actually seen a Hytale mob spawn. However, typically in video games, when a mob does spawn in close enough proximity to a player to need an animation, it'll crawl out of the ground. Unfortunately for Chorks, they breathe air, as we've seen in many gameplay clips in the past, and therefore cannot hide underground because they would suffocate and die. This is where my theory comes in. I believe that rather than traditional Minecraft-style spawning, where fully formed mobs spawn in a flash, the mob spawning that John is referencing is at the beginning of the Chork in-game lifecycle. Quebecs are a good example of this, since we know that their life cycle is going to exist in-game, and we know that it's going to be very detailed, so we can expect that fully grown Quebecs aren't going to spawn in on their own, with the exception of new chunk generation. Instead, they will seemingly spawn when their parent becomes a tree and releases their seeds, which are Quebec seedlings that start wandering around shortly after landing on the ground. So for Chorks, the spawning animation is going to be whatever brings baby Chorks to life. I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that Chorks do not do live childbirth, especially because there has been nothing that indicates that Chorks have more than one sex. That leaves a few methods of reproduction, but going off of real methods of asexual reproduction, I think that budding is the most likely option, where a part of a Chork will fall off and become a baby Chork. Alternatively, they could have Chorks that die of old age, I'm assuming that dying of old age will be a thing in this case, and have a couple of baby Chorks dig their way out and consume the parent, although that seems to be very gruesome for a block game. Similarly, we could have it such that a Chork can go and eat a cow, and then once the cow dies, whether that's from the Chork or from the player or whatever, doesn't really matter, some baby Chorks will emerge from the cow, consume the carcass of the cow, and then go on their merry way. And yes, all of these are real-life forms of reproduction that are done, at the very least, by parasites. This also begs the question if every single mob will have a spawning animation. Based on my theory, faction mobs will spawn for the first time when a chunk is generated, and then never spawn again. Perhaps with a couple exceptions, but mostly leaving population maintenance to the life cycle. We have also seen animations for skeleton spawning, only in the animated section at the end of the trailer. However, I am certain that skeletons will spawn similarly in-game, because it would be really strange to advertise it in the trailer and then not put it into the game. This leaves monsters, such as spiders, as well as farm animals. I suspect that spiders will spawn in the leaves of trees and fall out to avoid the jarringness of popping into existence and allowing for a jump scare factor in the game, and other monsters will likely have similar workarounds. But farm animals are a totally different ballgame, because players will be breeding them in pens close by to where they exist and play the game, and because they're largely based on actual creatures, the option seems to be between live childbirth and live breeding for mammals, or Minecraft-style breeding, where mobs smush their faces together and a small mob appears between them. Both options have their drawbacks, and Hypixel will have considered this carefully in designing their game, and I assume that they'll end up going with the Minecraft-style one, because otherwise getting the T rating could be rather difficult. Let's rapid-fire theorize about how the other factions will reproduce. Scarabs are obvious. The broodmother will lay eggs, which will hatch into larvae. Maybe they'll be fertilized by other scarabs from the colony, but typically your standard ant/bug life cycle. Varans are less obvious, as we know very little about them, and I'm not quite sure what they're based off of. They seem to be based off of foxes, which would again suggest live childbirth, so I figure Hypixel will have come up with some sort of creative workaround for this. Outlanders are kind of just directly humans, and humans also seem to exist in Orbis, so, you know, maybe this whole life cycle thing isn't the way to go for every single faction in Hytale. Perhaps for some, older creatures will walk into a house where they're out of sight of players, and then emerge alongside a baby? I don't know. This whole concept of having in-game life cycles becomes really weird once you move away from the fantasy creatures. Maybe I'm reading too far into it, and life cycles will only exist for fantastical creatures in the game, and the other ones will just have your traditional pop into existence spawning, or something similar. That makes the most sense to me, and I'm totally okay with Outlanders just having really long lifespans compared to the other creatures and occasionally magically appearing, if that means avoiding the difficulties of how to make them reproduce. All this talk makes me wonder if there will be creatures dying of old age, and how dead mobs will leave the world. We have previously seen this Chork disappear after losing a fight to a player, but it has been 5 years since that video was posted, and we are now in a completely different engine. Furthermore, we also know that Quebecs at the end of their life cycle, instead of dying, will turn into a tree. This has a bit of an issue with me in game, because surely if the Quebecs are continuously moving through their life cycle, every single Quebec village is going to have an ever-expanding graveyard of trees right outside of it, which I imagine would start encroaching on player territory and eventually take up the whole world. So hopefully there's some way, maybe the Quebecs will chop down their old trees and use them to create sungwood to prevent these dead forests from getting too large. Let me know in the comments what you think about mob spawning animations and potential mob death animations, and until next time, stay happy.